Hey guys, I wanted to put together a new video today just to walk through a few of the updates in the latest Stardust build that is out now. What they've added is 3D models being able to be applied to the particles. You can see on their examples and website some really cool ways that they've applied it. And it adds a lot more depth to an already deep plugin. So let's jump in and take a look at what we can do. Well, first off, I have a basic scene here just set up with the default emitter. So I'm going to jump over the particle and change the life to maybe 8 just to get it to be there a little bit longer. And they're moving outwards. Great. And I'm going to set the particle to be random from a gradient, and let's just pick a preset gradient and apply that. Cool. So now underneath our shape type, you can see that we have the ability to select model. So if we go down to I'm going to turn off my depth of field here. If we go down on our tab over here, we can see that we have model and material, 2 new nodes to add. So I'm going to apply the model to the particle. And by default, it's going to put cubes there because right now it's set to file and we're not pointing to a file. If you wanted to bring in a custom OBJ to put on the particles, you could bring in if you had something that, so if you look right here, if I drop this to primitive, the primitives are cube, sphere, plane, torus, cylinder. If you wanted to do hexagons, or you had something else that you wanted to emit on the particles, you can go ahead and bring that in. But I'm just going to walk through these kind of default ones. So cube here is all of this is going off of our particle size. So if I set this to be bigger, maybe 40, and let's just knock down our amount. And I also want to set the rotation to be motion based particle. So now that they will rotate based on their speed and direction. And it's already looking pretty cool, right? So we're done. Just kidding. So if we go up here under render settings, we have 2 new things that we've added. Well, actually a couple, but the 2 that we're going to talk about are environment and ambient occlusion. So if I turn on ambient occlusion, you get that nice shadow, adds a lot of depth to your particles. And then the other thing is environment. Let's skip that for right now, but the other thing while we're here is under render output. They added the ability to render out the diffuse, the depth, and your AO. If you want to, if you're comping and you need to separate things out, that gives you a lot of control there. Also quality settings. So now we have, this is for the anti-aliasing, since it's GPU based and accelerated, you can get, this kind of varies on how it's going to affect your speed per your machine. I'm just on an iMac late 2013 model, so it's nothing fancy, but you can see that it reacts pretty well. And if I go back and turn on depth of field, you can see that you get some pretty cool effects from just straight out of the box with the high setting. So cool. Gonna set that back to off and go back down to our model. And underneath our model, if you see under primitive, I have the size, which it's set to 1, and we were inheriting the 40 value that I plugged into here. So there's a couple of different size settings here. So you have it here. So if you wanted to, well, that's a little extreme, but if you wanted to have something that was elongated or custom size, you can play with that here. Or also underneath model size, if you were bringing in a model, I think this is more applicable, you can adjust kind of a global size there. Also, you might want to center your model if you brought it in. You have the options to flip it. If it's one-sided, you can tell it it's double-sided, which also is effective when using plane. And smooth normals, which I can show you right now, is for, let's say we wanted to add a bevel. Wow, that's a really big bevel, huh? Let's drop that to like 0.2 maybe. And still it's kind of hard to see, so I'm gonna drop in a light into our scene. Just make it white for now. And that'll help us see that bevel a bit better. So if I bring this forward and maybe duplicate it and put one in the back, just get some nice interesting lighting so that we can see this specular quality a little bit better. Maybe I set this back color to be cool. The front is warm. There we go. So you can see that we have a little bit of faceting along our edges here. So if I go back to model, if I turn on the smooth normals, it'll just iron that out for you and look a bit better. So pretty cool. Right away, we've taken a very simple emitter with really just default settings and kind of started to create something that looks pretty interesting. So the other thing we can do is if I have this HDRI, actually, let me pre-comp this and blur it real quick just to soften it up for our reflection. Blur Gaussian will be fine. Maybe 45. Yeah, it's fine. Cool. Bring that in. If I jump back up here to the top, I can do environment and apply that. It's pretty bright. So let's take, oh, you can also rotate it, I guess, while we're here. Talk about that, if that's your thing. Let me jump in there real quick and knock this back just because it's pretty intense. If I just throw maybe an exposure, bring that down. There we go. It's definitely not as intense. Cool. So that gives us, basically without that, we were kind of falling into a lot of darks. So if I turn it off, you can see where we were at before, and then now that environment, it's kind of really filling in all of that, which we have more control over if I drop down to the bottom down here and look at our new material node. So under material, we have a few settings here. So diffuse is obviously your color information, your flat color information. Right now, color from particle is set to 100. So if I set this to, let's say I wanted all these to be teal, and you see that nothing has changed, it's because it's inheriting my color gradient up from up here. So if I start dropping this value, you can see it's blending between them, and at 0 they'll all be the color you've set here. So this is really comes into play if you're going to start adding in textures. So if I make a kind of texture here, I'll just do like a 512, and we'll call this checker, and I apply generate checkboard to this, and maybe do something bigger, and just pre-comp this, move all attributes. Oh, I didn't mean to move all attributes, my bad. But we'll just have to reset our settings to 512. So there's our checker. If I drop down to material and I set that as our texture, you can see that we have that texture applied all over our cube. So now again, if I grab this color from particle and start turning this up, you'll see that it's blending between our texture and the gradient that we have applied up top. So you'll just have to take that in consideration if you're trying to do textures for the diffuse. But for now, I'm just going to set that to 100 to do the color from particle, and we'll just use that texture in our glossiness. So right now, the glossiness is our kind of like specular fall off. So if I set this really low, you see that it's just kind of really soft speck, and of course higher, really sharp. And so if I set this checker into here, you can see that if I just set this to 100, well, maybe like 90, you can see how that is affecting those two values. So where it's black, it's, you know, dropping our gloss amount to 0, and where it's white, it's using our value that we've set in the slider. So that does some really cool effects. And so I'm going to turn this off, just drop this back down to 50, its default value. And then if we look at our reflection, so reflection, if I start turning this up, it almost looks like it's getting darker, which is, it's reflecting that environment map that we had put in there. So same thing here, where I could drop in a checker here, and you can see that it is affecting the same thing where black is 0 and white is taking in that account. So I'm going to drop this back off, set this back to maybe just 10, and look at our next one, which is bump. So for bump, I have a couple of just basic normal maps here that I've brought in. This one is like some circuit board or something. I don't know, just Google search normal map. I didn't really put a lot of effort into that. So if I drop down here, back to our material, and drop in that normal map, set this to maybe 25, maybe 50, you can see that you get some really cool bump information off of that. I'm going to drop this bevel size back down lower. It's kind of stretching out the textures along the edges there. And yeah, so that's kind of like the 3 settings. And so when you start combining those, you know, if you combine, you know, back that glossiness back in there, you can kind of start layering and creating some complex shaders. The other thing that's really cool I've noticed is if you look at the bottom down here, it says material ID. If you bring in a model, I don't know if this is going to work. Try it. File. Pick a file. You'll see that there's a checkbox there that says bring in, so here's a just hexagon, import materials. So if you have an object that has materials assigned to it, it'll bring in the textures and colors associated with that. So this, I don't have anything assigned to this, so I'm just gonna not check that. And it looks like our model has disappeared. Well, that's just because our size, I'm gonna guess. So if I center it, maybe set this to smaller, we'll see that our particle size was super huge in my scene that I was working in when I exported that. So I could also adjust the size in the particle up there at the top, but I'm just going to do that because we have our model. So again, this is cool because you can bring in some really interesting custom particle shapes and make some really cool systems. And then the other thing you can do is, instead of doing a primitive or file, you can do a text or mask. So same thing, where if I create a solid here, just make it the comp size, I made some, I don't know, shape that you wanted to extrude. I'm going to call this mask and go back to our model and set our extrude layer to be mask. Now we have a bunch of lightning bolts. And we still get the bevel on this, which I think it is one-sided. So we have a bevel profile. So if I drop this down, you can see if I do, whoops. Yeah, there you go. You can see it right there. If I do, what is it, maybe distance? Ooh. And depth. You can kind of see what it's doing there. So if I Well, I also need to maybe up my samples a bit, which, no, that didn't really have any effect there. But anyways, so if you got crazy and wild, you could come up with some really cool custom shapes there and have, you know, even a custom bevel profile to apply to those, which is, you know, don't really get that with the primitives, but you do get it with the shape, since it can look at the perimeter of that. Again, you know, taking something very simple like the default emitter and turning it into something pretty cool that still runs at a really good frame rate. Probably could even RAM preview. Look at that. It's pretty cool. So the next thing that I would like to take a look at is how fields are interacting with these 3D models. So I'm going to go ahead and clean the slate real quick and wipe it back to 0 and just create a default emitter, but this time I'm going to make a grid, and let's make that grid maybe 1280, 720, and let's make it only 1 in the Y, or I'm in the Z, sorry, and let's rotate that in the X. So now we have like a flat, your basic flat grid. Cool. And now let's bring in a model back in and change our shape back over to a model. And now we have cubes that are aligned to our grid. Let's maybe double this up here. Maybe even more. Oops. Oh, I need to make my particle life longer, so let's just set this to 12. And there we go. So now we have our basic, if I drop down here, go to primitive, we have a basic cube setup, and I'll go ahead and add back in that bevel and maybe make it slightly bigger in the Z. Let's do Y. Cool. And then I'm going to add a turbulence. And if we add this turbulence, well, it doesn't matter. We can just do a global turbulence. And if I set it to affect rotation, you get some pretty cool effects if you're doing 3D. So then the next thing, let's maybe make that noise a bit bigger, less frequent, and then maybe just have it animate just so that we can kind of see what's happening. You can see it's kind of slowing down a bit because I decided to crank up the amount of particles there, but still you're able to get some pretty cool animations with some kind of basic setups. Now if I just drop this down to maybe less grid, maybe let's just do 10 by 10 so we can kind of see what's happening. And you can see you can come up with some pretty cool effects. And even if you did position, you could have it offset. So yeah, all your basic fields that you're building out for normal particle systems just carries on over to the models. So it's really cool. And then you could also, right now I've just been using, if I drop this size back down, I've just been using one model, but you could bring in a secondary one and apply it to the same system. And let's say you wanted to do spheres. And let's say we maybe adjust it there. Position maybe in Z. There, you can see you can apply multiple particle types to the same system and create, that's how if you looked at their website on that front image, you could see they have like some hexagons, spheres, and other things mixed in here. This one, they're using, they're doing a grid, and then by using maps and to affect the height and position of things, you can kind of create some interesting terrain. And then in that other example, I don't know how do you go back? Can you not? No? Okay. Well, on the other example, you can see when they're emitting around text. There you go. They're emitting multiple different types. So if I set this emitter to be default 10 and set them just to emit to maybe 100, you would see that as it's emitting, it's gonna, use both of these to emit along. So pretty cool. That's kind of just a very basic overview of what is happening, but I don't know if I have any of my quick times, but I've been playing around, and you can, once you start layering things, like this is with texture, you can see that it accepts transparency. I have like a grid and a spectrum animating. You can start to create some layered effects. This is with the Turbulence that I was just setting up right now, with cylinders that are squashed down in their Y. You can and you can see how the AO and the environment map are really attributing a lot of the look to this. And maybe I have something else, maybe not. No, this is emitting along a motion path, and again using the motion of the particle to drive the rotation of the cubes, and then the cubes are emitting auxiliary trails, which are inheriting the colors of the source particle. So have a go at it. Let me know if you have any specific questions. Hopefully that breaks the ice on these kind of like new features that they've added, and let me know if you make some cool stuff. All right, thank you.